Welcome to this video under the heading of Adobe Camera Raw. The subject here is strategic editing using the adjustment brush, the radial and the graduated filters. As our appreciation and skill level with image editing improves, what we tend to find is we use strategic editing more and more, because we tend to look around the image and see areas of the image that need that little extra work. Now, the tools we use for that are generally the adjustment brush, the graduated filter and the radial filters. These three tools all work very much the same, so it does allow me to deal with them all together. We can create as many adjustment brushes as we need, and each brush can be adjusted independently of each other, and we can do exactly the same with graduated and radial filters too. Each brush, for example, is controlled by a pin. That pin can be turned off, moved and edited, so we could have one brush to increase colour and another to decrease colour. So let's take a look at the adjustment brushes first, and as soon as we select any of these three main tools, all the options for those tools will open up on the right hand side. So let's go up first and select the adjustment brush, and way over on the right we can see all of those changes. We can think of this as being almost in two sections. The section down at the extreme bottom right controls the brush itself. You can see there's four sliders: size, feather, flow and density. Now you can see the size of the brush there, and if I move that slider to the right, the only way I can see if the brush is going to be big enough or small enough is to move back on the picture surface. Now that's quite inconvenient. So it's going to be much easier to use those square bracket keys to the right of the letter P, which adjust the size of the brush. The left hand one takes the brush down, the right hand one takes the brush up. This is exactly the same as the shortcuts in Photoshop. You'll also notice the brush is made up of two rings. The inner solid ring represents the solid part of the brush, but between there and the dotted outer ring, that's where the brush is soft or feathered, and you can see the feather slider here. So if I take the feather off, you can see that gap narrows, and if I push the feather way up to maximum, you can see it gets greater. Now I tend to use it at the midway point more or less. There's no hard and fast rules with these tools, and you'll find after a little while you'll probably set them and more or less use them at the same setting most of the time. Now I think the next slider is probably one of the most important. The flow controls how quickly the brush actually works, and if we keep that delicate and measured, you'll find it's much better for good quality image editing. And I've got it set for somewhere around 10 or 11 here, but even that may be a little bit on the high side, but that's something we can change as we start to do the work. The density, well, I normally leave that more or less in the center, and I find that meets most of my needs too. Whenever we select an adjustment brush, a graduated or a radial filter, the sliders above will always reflect the last settings we used. Now I'm going to deliberately change a few of these because it's not uncommon that when we actually move our brush onto the picture to start working, all sorts of odd things happen. So I'm going to make a start here by going to the man on the left hand side. I think I'll zoom in just a little bit, so I'm going to use those shortcut keys of Control Spacebar and just bring the image up a couple of taps, and I'll adjust the size of the brush using the square bracket keys. As I start brushing on the guy's face, you'll see that a pin will appear. That's the pin that controls this particular brush. But of course we've got all those previous settings which are looking pretty weird. So if I right click over the top of the pin, I can reset all those local correction settings. So if you look over at the right hand side, all those sliders, as I click this, every one of them is reset and the face comes back to normal. So I need to go to my sliders now and decide what I want to do. Well, I want to take down some of the highlights here and maybe a little exposure in certain areas. So I'm going to drop the highlights and the exposure a little bit, and I'm going to go back, and using my pin I'm going to start working, and as you can see I can start to darken certain areas of the image. Now remember what I said a few moments ago about the flow down at the extreme bottom right. I said 10, well I've got it at 11, but I said 10 is probably going to be a bit high. Well, I'm going to suggest it probably is. I'm going to drop it down to 8 and see how we get on. Just slows the brush down a bit, but you can clearly see I'm having an effect where I want to have that effect. Now of course I'm working what I call quick and dirty here. If you was doing this for real, we would zoom in a lot more and we would take a lot more care around the edges of the hat if we wanted to darken the hat, of course. So you can see I can actually change things in strategic areas. I'm going to hold my spacebar, click and drag. Let me have a go at these guys. I still think that the flow is a little bit on the high side, so I'm going to drop it down to 5. You can see rather than using the slider I chose to highlight the value and over type with the number 5. Just a personal preference, no rights or wrong ways here, but let me just show you a little bit more. But you can see how I can gradually now start to darken down just the areas I want to darken down, and that is the beauty of the adjustment brush. If I don't get it enough, I can go back to my sliders and I can drop the exposure a bit more. I can adjust the flow rate, so I've got a lot of scope here for personal choice. Now with the spinning round of the screen, I'm going to touch my P key on the keyboard to give you a view of before and after. Now I've done a little bit more than I would normally do with the adjustment brush here, just for demo purposes and to allow you to see the effect clearly. So touching the P key, there's the image we started with, and just with a bit of selected darkening you can see it does make quite a nice difference to the image. What you may also notice is the grass looks rather bright and a little bit too green. So this is where we could choose to make a second brush and have a go at doing the foreground with a completely different set of sliders. So let me give that a quick go by going up to the option just underneath the title adjustment brush and clicking new. So you'll notice the pin up on the guy's face has greyed out, and as I start to brush down here I've got exactly the same settings, but I've got a new pin. So I could decide maybe to take some saturation off, maybe I could decide to put some dehaze in, and all I've got to do now is to start doing the brushing down here, and that's completely independent to what I did before. Little bit round in the wheel there, and you'll notice that I'm doing this, as I said earlier on, very quick and dirty. In normal circumstances I would take a bit more care and I would bring the size of my image up, but there you can see it's quite quick and easy to use the adjustment brush as a strategic option. What I've just done is to click the Done button down at the extreme bottom right, just to lock in all of those changes to my raw file. Then I've opened it up via Adobe's Bridge, and of course when the image opens up, it opens up with the zoom tool selected way up at the top left. So I'm going to move up there and just reselect the brush for a moment. Instantly we get to see the two pins that we've used to do the work, which gives us the opportunity to select one or the other and make some adjustments. If I mouse over the pin, you can see that it shows me the mask, so it shows you what I've done. Never looks very attractive when we just see the mask, but it works pretty well. And the one down here too. If you want to see the mask for any reason, you can go down to the bottom right corner and turn it on by ticking the box. And if you wanted to remove any of those pins, of course, you just click them, turn them red and hit the delete key. Here I have a good image to demonstrate the graduated filter. I've done the global editing, but you can see that the sky is rather weak. I'm going to go up to the top of the screen. I'm going to pick up the graduated filter. All of the options will appear on the right hand side, but here of course it's not controlled by a brush, it's controlled by click and drag. Now let me do it and then I'll explain what you can see on screen. I'm going to start about halfway down. You'll soon get a feel for this sort of thing. I'm just going to click and drag down to that sort of point. Now first of all, the settings that I've got here are the ones that I had set a little while ago for the previous image. So once again we may have a need here to go within the overlay, right click and choose to reset the local correction settings. We'll do that to start with. Here as you can see we have a green pin and a red pin. The green pin starts the gradient, the red pin ends it. So it starts solid at this end, transparent at this end, and it'll be soft in the middle. If we make this longer, it'll be softer in the middle than it would be if we made it very tight. And if you move up into these areas here, it's probably a bit more convenient if you need to give it a tilt, which sometimes we do. Let me give you a feel for what I've done there just by dropping down the exposure, and you can see now everything is very tight. If I drag this down I can make it much more gradual, and the beauty is I can see what I'm doing as I do it. Now once I've got the graduated filter in place and it's doing a reasonably good job, I've got a number of options. I can drag it if I want it to be a little bit less severe. I can adjust the bottom area so I can bring it up and down, but I think it just needs to cross that horizon to work quite well. But of course I may want to have a look at clarity. I may want to put in a bit more colour in the sky. I may want to take down the blacks. And here's another thing we can do with a graduated filter. I've got a bit of lightness over here. So let's have a look at taking down the highlights. That's not having a great deal of effect on this area here. Nor is the white, a little bit but not much. But what we can do is perhaps deal with that with another gradient, especially the light bit there. So if I go up to the top here, I can click the new button, but I can also just go there and drag down. Remember, this is going to have the same settings as before, so we may want to right click and reset again and just drop the exposure down just to affect that corner. Maybe I'll rotate this a bit. Well, I think you get the idea pretty well. And this area here, of course, we could always deal with that with a brush, because we can use a graduated filter and an adjustment brush and a radial filter, which we'll look at next. Now what I've just done with this image is to click the Done button at the extreme bottom right to close the image down and lock in all of the changes into the raw file. Then I've used Adobe's Bridge to reopen it, and of course like before it'll open up with the zoom tool selected. So if I wanted to affect the gradients, and I did put a little bit of a adjustment brush in that bit of sky there, so we've got a pretty well balanced image here. But if I go back to my gradient tool and I click to liven this gradient up to start with, let me move this one away. I'll just select that and delete it for a minute, because what I want to do is to liven this one up, and we can go down and take a look at some colour. Let's click the colour panel. I'm going to put my cursor up there and I can take a look at the effect. Don't worry when you do this that the colour is way over the top. I'm just moving across the top to get a feel for what's going to work. I mean, it looks pretty good around that area. If I wanted a nice blue to combat the yellow, I think when we get up here it's not going to work so well. So let's have one more run along the top. I think in this particular instance something around here is going to be the colour. If I wanted a blue, that may be it. And now I can turn to the saturation here. Now I can temper that colour. So if I just wanted to put a bit of blue there, because blue and yellow go pretty well together, I could do that too. Now a moment ago I showed you how we made a second gradient. Well, the second gradient now would be keeping all of these settings, including the blue colour. So if I wanted to do what I did earlier on, yes, it's going to be dark, but I can double click the exposure and take it off, and I can just bring that down a little bit. We probably don't need any more clarity, and maybe I'll drop the saturation down just to balance things, but you can see we can fine-tune these graduated filters to suit almost any task. So let's assume we're happy with this image. We've got two gradients and a little bit of an adjustment brush in the middle right hand side. Now the last tool we may consider for strategic editing is the Radial Filter. Now the Radial Filter can be used in a number of ways. One of the more common ways is to apply a very simple vignette to an image. And what I'd like to do with this image is just do that to finish, and then we'll look at the Radial Filter with a different type of image. I'm going to make a start with the Radial Filter and click it. The options all appear on the right hand side. The one option that we may need to just take a look at is where the feather is, and I've got quite a high feather which suits my needs here, but for what I'm about to do, at least 50% and probably 70 or 80 would work just as well. I'll demonstrate how the tool works in a bit more detail in a moment, but for just this little example I'm going to double click and you can see exactly what happens. The Radial Filter is put in place. It remembers all the last settings we applied, including the colour down here. So I'm going to right click and reset those settings, and I'm also going to touch the V key, which is the equivalent of going down to the extreme bottom right and unticking that little box you can see there marked overlay. Now the overlay is still there and working, it's just hidden, because all I want to do here is put a little bit of a vignette around the outer edge. Maybe that is a little bit high. Let's drop it down to around 50. I'll reset that back, just drop it down a little bit. There you can see just a little vignetting, just holding in the outer edges. If I touch the P key, you can see the difference that it makes before and after, before and after. Let's finish off with this image and the Radial Filter. We can see we've got a problem here, so very quickly let's do the whole thing. Global editing and strategic editing too. Global editing. We've got a problem with highlights. Let's take the highlights away. Let's take some of the whites away. Okay, let's just drop the exposure on the background just a touch. Not too bad. Then maybe just lift the shadow so we don't lose too much light on the bird. Maybe a little touch of clarity, and we're getting there. But now let's go up and select our Radial Filter. And all I'll do here is just click and drag, and there you can see the shape I've created. Now once the shape's made, I can click inside and move it around, and you can see it's controlled by a pin, exactly the same as the adjustment brush. I can drag this out, I can make any shape I want, I can move it around, I can go outside of the overlay and rotate. So I can rotate this down over the bird, bring it down something like that. If you look down at the options, you notice apart from the feather, we also have the opportunity to affect outside of the overlay or inside. Well, we want to affect outside here. So let's take a look by touching the V key, which just removes the overlay. Then perhaps I can drop the exposure, which is going to affect the background much more than the bird. In fact, it should miss the bird completely, and we can adjust the feather to make sure that happens, or bring the overlay back, and if we think we've gone a bit too tight, as you can see, we've got the opportunity to make an adjustment. I'll touch the V key again. I'll take the highlights down. If I want to take a bit of colour off the background, I can do that too. And we've got a result in a very short time. Now I think that looks pretty good straight away, but if you feel that maybe this top corner is a bit paler than the front part of the image, or where the bird's looking, then perhaps we can go and pick up our gradient tool, drag that down, and we'll reset it, I think, and just give a little tweak at the top just to hold it in a little more. Not much. And then, because we're looking at a bird here, perhaps one of the things we could do is pick up our adjustment brush. Let's zoom into the bird's face. The most important part is this area here, so maybe we could just lift the exposure a little bit there, just a touch, not much. Maybe tweak the saturation. You get the idea. Just something to draw us in to the business end of the bird. And there we have our image. Now once again, I've hit the done button down at the bottom right to lock in all of the changes that I've made. But I've actually got on here an adjustment brush, a graduated filter, and also a radial filter. But there's more. If you look down at the bottom right, we've got a bit of a distraction there. Well, we're going to come back very shortly with some of the other tools in Camera Raw, and I think we may use this picture and we'll deal with that bottom corner. So I think by now you've probably got a pretty good idea just how valuable these tools are.